I'm Jennifer Herline, Executive Director at French Heritage Society. Thank you so much for joining us today. All of us at French Heritage Society are grateful for your continued support of our mission to ensure a future for French architectural and cultural heritage here in the United States and in France. I would like to take a moment to recognize our board members who are here with us today. We have Board Chairman Elizabeth Stribling, Cece Black, Jean-Doyen de Montaillou, David Gray, Isabelle Laroulière, and Judy McLaren. We all appreciate everything that you do. As we all know, what you'll see is the result of a team at work. So I would also like to take a moment to thank the FHS staff for their work on today's program. Natalie May, Jack Meyer, and Ben Wells. And now I'm thrilled to welcome Paris-based journalist and author Lindsey Tramuta, who recently published the new Parisienne, The Women and Ideas Shaping Paris, which lifts the veil on the mythologized Parisian women. Featuring more than 40 activists, creators, educators, visionaries, and disruptors, such as Leila Slimani, Lauren Bastide, and Mayor Anne Hidalgo, the book reveals Paris as a blossoming cultural center of feminine power. A Philadelphia native, Lindsey has been a Paris resident since 2006. She's a culture and travel journalist, author, podcaster, and editorial consultant. Since 2012, she has been a Paris correspondent for international publications such as the New York Times, T Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Bon Appetit, Condé Nast Traveler, and more. Lindsey's first book, The New Paris, The People, Places, and Ideas Fueling a Movement, was named one of the 10 best travel books of 2017 by Smithsonian Magazine. Lindsey will be speaking with FHS's very own Maureen Nash. A New Yorker currently based in Dijon, Maureen is on French Heritage Society's board of directors and is a founding co-chair of our Young Patron Circle. Maureen has led over $75 million in fundraising campaigns in the cultural sector, including work at the New York Public Library, the Frick Collection, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Arts and Design, and the Itzhak Perlman Music Program. Currently, she is researching French and American board governance and philanthropy models at the Burgundy School of Music. It's so great to see you both. And before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. I simply want to reiterate that today's conversation will last about 40 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. You'll be muted during the talk, but are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A feature on your screen. It should be along the bottom. Maureen will monitor these questions and ask them following the talk. Maureen and Lindsey, welcome and thank you both.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And welcome, Lindsey.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Reading your book was an absolute joy for me, and fair warning to all of our audience. After I read it, it inspired me to take a quick little trip to Paris this weekend. So others
Excellent.
might do the same. So I wanted to begin, and Lindsey asked the readers, her readers to consider, and I'd like our audience to do the same. Quote, what do you see when you close your eyes and think of Paris? What about when you imagine the women of Paris? This is a theme that she comes back to again and again. And in fact, one of the women that she interviewed, journalist, filmmaker, and anti-racist Rokhaya Diallo, said the following: there's a whole image around the Parisienne that needs to be reconstructed because it's been a long time since she's looked like Brigitte Bardot and Edith Piaf. So Lindsey, would you talk about the concept of the new Parisienne, the title of your book, and what sparked this project that is so unbelievably timely?
Well, thank you for that introduction. You know, the Parisienne is, as you described by quoting Rokhaya Diallo, who kind of nailed it in that one line, which is to say that, you know, the women cannot be summed up by a handful of figures. And those figures are quite old. They've been around for generations, and yet they're still some of the images that we summon when we think of Parisian women. And that's problematic for a whole number of reasons, including just the variety of people that leaves out from from the story. So if you think
Absolutely.
about what all these women have in common, whether it's Inès de la Fressange, or it's Brigitte Bardot, or Caroline de Maigret, or any number of figure, they tend to be white, able-bodied, heterosexual, fairly affluent, and certainly do not fall outside of any sort of white Catholic notion of what a Parisian or what a French woman is. And that simply does not reflect the majority. Well, it does not reflect the population appropriately. And so after the first book came out, I was doing a lot of thinking about, the ways in which Paris continues and continued to be portrayed in a certain light, which for me felt like a very narrow view of a city that I have, experienced firsthand now for 14 years. And it felt like it was never being sold properly. It was never being adequately portrayed for all of its wonderful diversity and richness in culture and opportunity and innovation. And similarly, the way people are presented are part of that, limited viewpoint. And as I was starting to think about this, I started to, pick up on just how frequent the articles are that talk about how French women, so obviously we're already painting with broad strokes because we're not specifying Parisian women, we're saying all French women, are able to do everything better. We should follow their lead when it comes to parenting, when it comes to eating, when it comes to dressing ourselves, when it comes to sort of developing a whole number of attitudes about life.
It's an impossible ideal. Yes.
It's impossible. It's impossible, and it also preys on the insecurities of women everywhere. And most susceptible are perhaps Americans, because they've eaten up all these things in the millions. And so I just started to feel very frustrated with this. So the book is a way of not only addressing that myth and that kind of reductive narrative around Parisian women, but it's also to say, here are more than 40 other women who deserve to be celebrated. It's not to say that the women who have been sort of the figureheads of this imagination or this fantasy aren't real. And I'm not saying we should replace them. I'm saying we should highlight a sort of a more representative picture. And broaden the image that we're depicting. And so this book is a way to say, the Parisienne that I'm putting forward is not necessarily new in that she's never existed, because she has. It's that we rarely get to see her or talk about her in these ways and really understand the ways in which she navigates the city and navigates life, and what kinds of things she's overcoming, and how the city maybe helps or hinders that process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I loved how in your book you do exactly that you're representing Parisian women who have with the wild diversity. And one of the things that you do in your book is you use these different archetypes to categorize them, from activists to creators to disruptors, storytellers, taste makers, which I particularly liked, and visionaries. And your profiles are, as I said, wildly diverse, from bakers and fashion designers, which is maybe what we would think of, but also Olympic silver medalist boxers and aeronautical engineers. And so what I thought we could do today is take a little sneak peek into some of your interviews. And we've selected a woman or two from each of your categories. So the first is the activist Lindsey Bastide, who is a modern feminist and a founder of the podcast Le Poutre. And if you could talk to us about your experience interviewing her.
Yeah, so Lauren is sort of one of the most visible figures of this, I would say, intersectional feminist movement in Paris, or in all of France. And one of the ways she's been able to really anchor herself to this movement is through this podcast. And you have to keep in mind that podcasting is still a much more recent phenomenon in France. We've obviously followed in the footsteps of some really great examples coming out of the US. And La Poudre has had, I would say, at the time of writing, I want to say it had 2 million downloads, but that has, that was as of end of 2018. And the show has continued to grow and grow. And she's interviewed women ranging from political figures to activists to musicians and athletes and humanitarians, and all of it is to really give them the mic. And I think that's important to note, because Lauren's greatest skill is, I think, taking herself out of the limelight. So she sets it up, she asks her questions, but she really lets these women tell their stories in a way that we're not always used to hearing, especially in France, where women are given very little airtime. And so that this show is completely devoted to women's stories and their efforts, whether it's, their sort of civic engagements or their professional lives. I think she's created something that transcends socioeconomic groups. And so what you have is a young generation of feminists, or sort of curious feminists, who are trying to understand what a woman's place is in society, and listening to this show as a way of trying to understand that better. And what I think she has done so tremendously is to reach women who are perhaps quite affluent, women who are very privileged, and also those who aren't. And so I think she's been able to awaken a lot of different perspectives in people who may not have been exposed to some of these stories and ideas. And so in that way, she's a very important figure. She's also done books, she's led talks. So she's really doing a very good job of showing up, as we're talking about a lot today, for other women who may need that little extra support to get their messages out there. So speaking to her was wonderful, because I knew that, everything she's doing is so important. But what I liked discovering about her was her background, which I remember her from the days when she was the editor-in-chief of Elle magazine. And, seeing that transition and that journey for her from sort of one of the most iconic women's magazines that at times could fall very much into those stereotypes that, that I'm talking about, and that she now sort of breaks down as well in her work. But she also was very much the person who was trying to bring very serious pieces to the forefront, to talk about prostitution, to talk about sexual assault, and all of the themes that, might be sort of standard now in a broad magazine covering women's issues, but at the time it wasn't. So, she's always been at the forefront of these discussions and finding the individuals who are equally as active in these areas. So the podcast was, for me, not a surprise to see her develop, and certainly a format that has led the way for a lot of other individuals and creatives to get their thoughts out there. So, she's done a great amount of good, whether it's as sort of an activist or even just as a creator in multimedia. So I'm very much impressed by her.
Great. Well, one of my favorites, and I'm sure a number of our audience, who all of us are big Francophiles who love French architecture and French history, would love to hear about your experience meeting the architect Aline Esmar-Daman, who recently oversaw the artistic direction for the reopened Hôtel de Crillon. I saw it myself. It's so beautiful. Yeah. Don't spare any details. You have a lot of architecture buffs here today. And I'd also love to hear about your experience touring her culture and architecture, the firm that she created.
So Aline was born in Beirut. She grew up very much, she was French educated in Beirut, but grew up among bombs in a city very much unfortunately defined by its moments and its many number of years of wartime. So, you know, this is someone who grew up seeing destruction around her, but found a lot of comfort in literature. And so when the very first time I met her, it was for a different story I was working on, and I was sitting in her office and I was seeing all these materials, whether it was, you know, marble or fabrics and, you know, storyboards and mock-ups, but also this vast library. So she reads everything. She reads classic literature to, you know, modern art and architecture works in English and French. And her mother, who taught literature, really instilled this in her. So when the bombs were falling, when the glass was breaking in their house, you know, she was the one who was off in a room reading as a means of protection, of coping, of escapism. And that really stayed with her throughout her life. I think she also started to see, which is understandable, you start to see the beautiful aspects in all of this destruction. And so as she was going through school, she knew that architecture was a way for her to potentially give back, to be part of a regeneration of her city at some point, and certainly to go on and build other things and create. So what I find so fascinating about her, and this was obvious even in her office, which is located in Saint-Germain, so, you know, very much a picture perfect Parisian neighborhood around, you know, a lot of art galleries, around very iconic cafes that were frequented by philosophers. I mean, it's no surprise to me that she's in that neighborhood, because it's very much the Paris, I think, that she was reading about when she was in Beirut. And her firm is small. I mean, I think there are about 10 or 11 people, but started off doing private residence. She had previously, before she started the firm, she was working for Jean-Michel Villemotte, who is a very well-known architect and has done a tremendous number of projects all over the world, including many in France. And, you know, that really put her on a track to ascend. She had a lot of opportunity, but started off mainly in residential projects, until there was this, you know, call for projects for the renovation of the Hôtel de Crillon, which is now a Rosewood property. And she oversaw the artistic direction, which means, you know, she wasn't necessarily the one designing all of the, or sort of rebuilding the spaces, so to speak, but she certainly brought it to life and created a story. And story, as you can imagine, for someone who's, you know, a bibliophile, is extremely important. And so for her, there's no project without a very clear, heartfelt, genuine story. And so that's what she tried to offer and bring to life in the hotel, but also modernizing it, trying to come up with details, whether it's sort of the chandelier that's made partly of chain, and you know, to bring it a contemporary feel. Meanwhile, the ceiling is still, you know, a painted fresco as it was before. She tries to combine old and new, and she does that very, very well, because she's you know, she's done a lot of work researching and understanding decorative arts, just like Karl Lagerfeld, who was sort of the guest star that she brought onto this project. And so that was the other fascinating element of talking to her, was learning how she got his attention for this project. She didn't know him before, but she's a woman who understood what he was about. He also loved 18th century decorative arts. And he was very fond of the written word. And so as a way to sort of appeal to his sensibility, she wrote him a letter and dropped it off at the bookstore that he owned prior to his death. And said, said to the book, whoever was there at the time, you know, will you make sure this gets to Mr. Lagerfeld? And in 24 hours, she had received a phone call from him saying that he would be, you know, honored to work on this project. And the idea was that he would be involved on the special suites. So, you know, the very big spaces, and he would sort of have carte blanche to imagine it the way he saw fit with her assistance. And that's how she got his attention. And they did go on to work on this project together and have a fantastic collaboration. She also brought on other artists and architects to design specific pieces for different rooms. So and many of them were women. So, it wasn't just an all-female project, but she did take care to bring on as many, female talents as she could. So that gives you a real understanding of sort of how she operates, and she tries to seek out everyone's specific skills and talents to bring this project to life. At the Jules Verne restaurant, which is within the Eiffel Tower, she also led that project. And that was everything from, just not just overseeing, but really making all the big decisions. And similarly, she created a story based on the work of Jules Verne, who she had written, or whom she had read, from cover to cover. So knew all of his works, knew which lines and extracts to pull from to decorate the table. In fact, I have an example right here. This was, it's from Les Aventures du Capitaine Hatteras. So it's from that work, and it's a line that you can't see it because it's etched in, but she essentially pulls, one line, and not even the most iconic line from the text, but something that really spoke to her. And this is just a thick, very thick card. But when you're in the restaurant, all of these lines are place settings. So when you arrive at the restaurant, you're sort of immediately immersed in the world of Jules Verne, and with great grandeur and luxury and an attention to detail. And so the fact that, there's a woman who is not French born, who is reimagining these spaces and bringing them into the future, I think is a huge testament to her talent, and also the openness or the growing openness of the architecture world to give her that space.
Absolutely. Thank you. The next person I wanted to ask you about, of course, is the mayor, who I think to a lot of people, she's the first female mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. And I think to many people, she kind of symbolizes this new Parisienne and this sort of changing culture and changing society. And one, I want to know how you got the interview, what it was like, what she was like, and the policies that she's implemented, whether or not they're controversial or not, how you see Paris, how you see that it's already changed, that it's changing quickly.
So that was the hardest interview, obviously, to acquire. She has become highly solicited, and sought after. So that was months and months of sort of pushing with her team to grant me some time with her. In the end, due to a whole number of things, including the Gilets jaunes strikes and all of the things she was managing at the same time, it ended up being an over email exchange. However, I've met her previously, and I know that she is someone who does want to spend time with you. So unfortunately, for someone who is now pulled in 10 million different directions, it's not that easy to get that time, or for her team to grant her that time with people, because it's, because of what's on her plate. But it was definitely her. I had a few very specific questions. Obviously, with a personality like that, I didn't need the whole backstory. All of that I knew. I've been following her from the beginning. But what I really wanted to understand was how she saw the next 10, 20 years for Paris, and, what was hard for her about becoming a mayor and taking all the heat that we are so familiar with women taking when they're in the political space. And also how she gets around. What is she doing when she on the rare moments that she's not working? And so that I was able to exchange with her about. And I think she's someone who goes up against a lot, however, is willing to be unpopular for what she believes in. And I think, in today's world, it's very difficult to, as a woman, to sort of have that shield to be able to go up against the backlash and the vitriol and the constant criticism, and still uphold what you really believe in. And I think she's been doing a very good job of that. And the big theme for her is obviously the environment and making Paris more breathable, more livable, a healthier place for all of us to live and visit. It's obviously a very polluted city. It's been very car dependent for a long time. Her policies are meant to sort of give the city back to its citizens, and that includes pedestrians and people who are prepared to traverse the city by bike. Obviously, the metro and public transport system is excellent and super efficient. That predated her, of course, but she has made policies that have made transportation free for even children under the age of 11, and trying to extend the metro so that it covers locations that have been poorly served. And all of that is a way to say that this is not something, as one of the world's leading capitals, this being, the environmental crisis that we can no longer ignore, is not something we can take lightly in the city. So the car ban or the attacks on this reliance on vehicles has not made her a popular figure among many people.
And none with a car.
If you drive a taxi, I'm sure you dislike her as well, because it makes your job much more difficult. A lot of streets have become pedestrian.
Yeah.
The riverbanks, the areas called the Quai de Seine have been blocked off also. That used to be, kind of almost like a mini highway to cross the city. All of that is blocked off to cars now. So certainly that creates a certain pressure. But I think she knows that in order for there to be change, we need to push through. She's also done a lot of work in the social space. So opening up the Hôtel de Ville for homeless women, women who have been abused, trying to create services where women are meant to feel safer and have resources that they can obtain with the city's help. So, it's not just let's greenify Paris. Her efforts go far beyond that. And now, since the pandemic, she has rolled out a whole number of different measures, including 50 kilometers more of bike lanes that were meant to be temporary. And now that she's won re-election, we've heard that she actually intends to make them permanent. Giving access to restaurant owners to sort of spill into the streets and, free of charge for now. But, understanding that there are things that need to be done for the city to be thriving again. The most recent example, which maybe some of the audience members have heard about, the heaters that are out on cafe terraces that allow people to eat and smoke and drink outside even during the winter are going to be banned. But it won't take effect this calendar year. But coming in 2021, that will no longer be an option. One might say that that's a very easy, sort of a low-hanging fruit when it comes to environmental energy-saving measures that she can take. Is it the most, energy dense? Perhaps not, but certainly it's a shift, and it's a shift
Absolutely.
that she can roll out. So all of that to say, she's a very busy woman with a lot of big projects, including getting us up to the Olympics in 2024, which has, the city's been undergoing a tremendous number of projects to get us ready for that. And, I think ultimately she's someone who, having grown up very much working class, having seen, having climbed her way up to the top and trying to fight barriers along the way, people who said she would never amount to this, who, she would never sort of get out of the shadow of her predecessor. She has shown that she is very capable and she is a strong leader. And I know from having, been in Paris during the 2015 attacks and these unforgettable moments of trauma and tension in the city, even after that, she's been a very reassuring leader. And I think that, for many of us, that's not insignificant.
Yeah.
So we look at her as sort of a guardian in a number of ways.
It seems like she really does epitomize the idea of the new Parisienne who's the disruptor.
Yes,
and just
she's very much a disruptor.
And all the change that she's put forth. So the next archetype I wanted to hit on was the storyteller, and I thought one that would be particularly interesting for all of my friends and colleagues at the French Heritage Society is Heidi Evans. She's the creator of Women of Paris tours, and our audience members are people who a lot of them have homes in France and Paris and have traveled to France many times and really know their French history and are always sort of looking for a new angle and interest. And her company was new to me, and so I look forward to going on one of her tours, but I'd love to hear from you about your experiences.
So Heidi is someone I met through a mutual friend before ever knowing what her company, what her work was really about. I knew that she gave tours that were a little bit unique, but it wasn't until I really started to look at what she was doing, and when she sent me a message to check out what she was offering that I got to go on one of the tours and really understand how limited some of the storytelling has been on other tours. So her perspective is that she came to Paris from London, trying to figure out what her career was going to be, and started guiding. A lot of foreigners come to the city, and when they're in between gigs, they'll start offering guided tours with different companies, because there's, in a normal year, no shortage of tourists who are looking to have these experiences. And what she quickly realized was that women came up very little in the average narrative about Paris. So you talk a lot about the men who have shaped Paris history, the great thinkers, the writers, the builders, the politicians. Almost all of them are men. And any of the women that were highlighted, whether it was, the rare artist or some of the literary figures and certainly philosophers, were portrayed in very much the usual light, which is to say that they were rebellious and they were bad girls, and they were not, great in number. So she sort of took a step back and thought about this, and thought about how damaging that is long term when you consider that people taking tours are effectively giving themselves an informal education. And for the story to be so incomplete means that people are going around and going on with their lives with an improper picture of women's role in a city like Paris. So on one of her tours that I took, she talked about some of the figures like Colette and Georges Sand and even Simone de Beauvoir, but really the earlier literary figures who were considered sort of mediocre. I mean, women's literature wasn't taken seriously at that time. And so she said, that's one of the reasons why she found it to be so important to talk about how many women did actually write about, or not just write about Paris, but write in Paris and really create a literary canon for women. But it goes beyond just literary figures. When you think about the thinkers and the modern contemporary women who have shaped Paris, that does not make your average walking tour. So what I liked about her was that she really drew from her own ignorance, and it wasn't, a willful ignorance, but really just to say, I also didn't know a lot of these things about the city. Well, what a surprise, because we're not often taught some of this, and wanted to say that there's an opportunity here. There's opportunity to tell these stories differently and to almost in a way correct the errors of the past. And that also makes it possible for her to really extend that story into the women of modern day Paris who are making big change. So, I think her aim is, once tourism rebounds, is that she could really build these thematic walks into far beyond historic sort of experiences, but really tackle the women of today who are instrumental in creating the Paris that we know and the Paris we will come to know. So I like her energy. I like the way that she believes strongly in tourism and travel as an education. And finally, there's someone who's trying to tell these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The next person I wanted to ask you about is Miriam Sabat, the founder of Maison Elf, who is bringing the flavors of Levant pastry, of the Levant pastry scene to Paris.
So Miriam was born in Syria, spent some time, I know she was educated in Canada, and then has been in France for, I want to say 20 years or more. And what I loved about her when she arrived onto the pastry scene, it was this energy that she immediately had when she was meeting, you know, her new clients and talking about what her vision was for Levantine pastry. So we think of Levantine pastry as being very heavy, very, you know, sort of cloyingly sweet, lots of sticky, sort of unpleasant in the sense that, you know, at the end of a heavy meal, you don't want something like that. And she said, you know, I remember having a much different, or she had a much different memory of some of those desserts in her own family. And yet here, you know, anytime you would bring what you could find in Paris to a dinner party that were sort of in that category of pastries, people would be like, oh, okay, it's going to be that kind of meal. And she said, you know, there's a way to do this better. So she had been working in finance and was, you know, very much on a different path, a corporate path, one in which she was rising in the ranks and, you know, arguably very successful in that type of a field. But of course, as the story goes, she did not feel fulfilled. She was working like crazy, and there was a whole political aspect to working in banking that that didn't resonate with her. And after she had her first child, she realized that this was just, you know, an untenable
Not for her.
life path. And so she started to rethink what she wanted to do. She had, again, this anecdote of people seeing Levantine pastry as something that's, you know, overly rich and not very refined. That sort of stayed with her. And so she went and trained as a pastry chef, trained in France, you know, so has a very traditional classic French pastry skill set, but wanted to use that to bring something new to the scene. And she came along at a time when there was already a lot of experimentation in pastry in Paris. There was a lot more openness to different flavors, flavor pairings, formats. And so she came along with Maison Aleph, which is a nod to not only Syrian pastry, but the pastries that you tend to find in that part of the world. So whether it's Turkey or Jordan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, you know, it really unites the confections of that part of the world. And she does so with far less sugar, you know, with these beautiful flavors, a lot of rose and pistachio, and, you know, sourcing nuts and ingredients from the best places, and offers something that's really unique. So in the book, there's a photo that will, you know, that I'll see if I can pull it up, that highlights what these look like, and they really are pretty striking and delicious. And she's really become very successful in the Marais, because you know, the Marais is a historically Jewish area, and they too understood her reference, you know, calling it Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and you know, understanding the flavors that she was trying to express. You know, she's become, you know, very much a figure of the modern pastry movement now. So I loved her story because, first of all, she brings something very fresh and unique. And she's kind of an example of the new Paris, which I talked about in the first book, of people who, you know, switch careers and are really bringing Paris in a new direction, you know, a new entrepreneurial direction. So she's another example of that. And she's really well loved in the pastry community.
Absolutely. This leads me to my next question about multiculturalism, and this is sort of a theme running through your book, or the French idea of it. The concept of multiculturalism and celebrating our differences arguably runs through the veins of American society, and but is perceived very differently in France. This universalism and colorblindness or colorblind universalism is celebrated under the Republic, and for example, when I moved to France, I was shocked to find out that they don't collect data on race and religion, and that it's illegal, and if it's not tracked, how can you measure it, and how can you measure the discrimination, and everything is just anecdotal. And so it was a fascinating concept for me. So I know that you interviewed 40, 50 women, but could you highlight sort of some of the themes and issues that some of the interviewees grappled with relating to this big issue, which I think is very timely. I mean, I'm shocked this book was written, that you started this book 2 years ago and not this spring. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I couldn't have predicted this either, this timing for its release. However, it does go to show that these issues have almost been like trying desperately to come out in a bigger way. And this was the proper context for that to happen. All the built up frustration, the stressors from the pandemic and confinement, I think allowed all of this to erupt everywhere. And so here, you're thinking, you have to think of how long the conversations around race and discrimination have been very uncomfortable and very much pushed under the rug all over France. So what you were talking about, which is universalism and the way that the French view race and sort of any kind of difference, is basically a context which means it's very difficult to compare it to the US example. But what I will say is that
different model.
What did you say?
It's a totally different model.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Different way of thinking.
Absolutely. So essentially, all citizens are meant to be equal under the Republic. And the French like to believe themselves colorblind. So as you said, any emphasis on diversity, ethnicity, or race is almost seen to potentially undermine unity and social cohesion. They're viewed almost as threats to the Republic. So when you think about a U.S. or an American society that values all of our differences in the way that we can come together still under the nation, that is not the way. That is not the celebrated model here. So, and the other element to this context that's very particular is, as you said, that collecting data is illegal, and that goes back to World War II and how statistics were exploited to target Jews and homosexuals and other groups. So the problem with this, and this is what many of the women face in the book, is that France then is in this position of sort of hiding behind this universalism and this colorblindness that they so believe that they have within them, but are not addressing the discriminations that do exist and don't really allow themselves to have the data to back it up. So I look at this as, and not only me, but after talking to many of the women, so whether it's Rokhaya Diallo, the activist, or Sarah Zouak, who has a foundation called La Lab, which gives a voice to Muslim women, or any number of women, this comes up even in more discreet ways, is that France effectively wields colorblind universalism as a kind of tool for the denial of discrimination. And then when race was removed from the Constitution in 2018, critics viewed that as further evidence of sort of an overall great discomfort with discussing this, but it needs to be discussed. So that's one big point, is this universalism. The other theme that comes up a lot is laïcité, which is the French version of secularism, but it can't really be reduced to just secularism, because it really goes deeper than that. You're supposed to be allowed to practice whatever beliefs you have in the privacy of your own home, but in the public space, you are not meant to show any sort of overt sign of religious affiliation. So in theory, that goes for not only the Muslim headscarf, but it also goes for any other religious symbol. In practice, though, the various iterations of the laws on laïcité have appeared to be a means of a means for France to sort of deal with its problem with Islam. So this is obviously, you know, we don't have enough time to go into this in great detail. I do try to give enough of a background on this in the book so that people understand that when it comes to talking about national identity in France, you know, who gets to be French, and who is given certain opportunities, and what background those people are meant to have to be considered French is an ongoing discussion that started many, many, many years ago, actually in the 80s. And so that I talk about that as well. But religious affiliation is one of these tense topics. And so you have, you know, this backlash from populations who believe that they're still living out the principles of laïcité by, you know, praying in the home or wearing a veil in spaces that are not public, and yet are still being told that they do not belong, that they are not meant to be wearing, you know, these garments. So it's very much a theme that comes up not only with the Muslim women in the book, but other activists who look at any oppression against women, whether it's, you know, discrimination, you know, for their religious beliefs or their body shape or their, you know, whether they wear makeup or don't wear makeup. Any of these sort of attacks on a woman's right to choose is really a running theme through the book. And even the rabbi Delphine Orvilleur, who is fantastic, also brings up the issues of laïcité and how the idea at its core is very positive, and all of the women who even are very sensitive to the way that laïcité has been distorted believe that at its core it is a good thing to have, but it's been abused, and the way the policies are functioning today leaves too much room for certain groups to be targeted and silenced or, you know, squashed. So those are two really big themes. In addition, you have themes of also certainly belonging when it comes to where you grew up, you know, the women who are from the suburbs and, you know, grew up knowing about the périphérique, which is the beltway that runs around Paris, and creates almost this mental or psychological barrier that makes people feel really unable to ascend because they come from this other side. That's starting to change as the other side of the périphérique becomes part of Greater Paris, and we're trying to use, you know, Greater Paris as an idea more and more. Those barriers are going to start to come down, and Hidalgo does have plans for, you know, how we can change what that beltway looks like and make it less of a, you know, depressing, you know, physical barrier between the two. But that idea of, you know, where you come from and how you belong in this place and then how you're treated is a running theme, even for the women who were, you know, born in the suburbs and raised in French families. You know, that's a big theme.
That brings us full circle. I'm so impressed by this book and the profiles, and inspired by the women and leaders in this book. And you're able to touch on sort of so many timely themes. And before we go to our Q&A, I wanted to do you're famous, you're well known for having a great Paris guide. And there's another one in the book where you ask all the interviewees their favorite places. So I'd like to do a rapid fire. Don't think about it, just tell me. Your favorite place for pastries?
Ooh, Bon Temps. Bon Temps is specialized in sablé. I believe I do mention that in the guide.
Okay. Dinner.
Oh no, there are too many options. Pierre Song.
Okay. A museum or artistic installation, artistic environment.
The Musée de la Vie Romantique in the 9th.
Okay. Cafe.
For coffee, Dream and Man.
Bar.
Le Marie Celeste.
Bookstore.
Ooh, Galignani and Shakespeare & Co.
Fromagerie.
Taco e Vermo. It's in the 10th.
Okay. And finally, for all the audience who love to flâner around Paris, your favorite place to stroll?
The Palais Royal Gardens.
Thank you. So it looks like, thank you very much. I know that we've got some questions here. So the first question is from Jill. And she asks, and naturally there's a breadth of definitions of what a Parisian woman means. Nevertheless, is there still, in your opinion, a look and style philosophy that remains the classic Parisian woman to this day? And in her frequent trips to Paris, she does notice the change, but is there a classic Parisian woman?
I wouldn't say there's so much a classic Parisian woman as there are certain values. And maybe that's about, you know, taking good care of yourself and believing that you have a right to exist and being heard. I do feel like that's common among all of the women, even those who resemble the, you know, the fantasy. There's really this idea that we should speak up and we should take up space because we've been denied that space. And, you know, that goes along with the very important movements across, you know, over the last 50 years for women to fight for their rights. So this idea of demonstrating whether you're, you know, you looked like Jane Birkin or you were, you know, from an immigrant family, that's very much still part of the Parisian spirit. And so I see that as being something that unites all of them rather than one specific look. And I think today, because of social media, you have inspirations that women are seeing and adopting from all over. And so we're starting to, that, you know, sort of iconic look that is part of the fantasy is being distilled naturally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, we've got another question from Natalie, and I love this question. What are your thoughts on the French Women Do It Better book? I mean, to me, this is bringing up baby and French women.
Yeah, that genre is part of what really frustrated me and why I wanted to do this book, because when you really dig into it and why they have worked so well is because they're preying on insecurities among other, you know, among people. And many of those books are not targeting the French reader, you know, they're targeting foreign women. So if you think about the insecurities and the guilt tied up in mothering and parenting among American men and women, specifically, I'll speak to that. You know, that these books come along and claim to have the answers, or at least some form of an inspiration or aspiration for American women to work toward, even though the systems that exist, the social and economic systems, don't necessarily allow for the same model to work in America. When it comes to books about, you know, French women don't get fat and all of this, it's all preying on our sense that we are not good enough and that somehow the French are always doing everything better, which none of them believe really themselves. So to me, this looks like something that can be exploited and sold. And that comes in the mind of a French writer because they know that there are these insecurities in place. So I think it's a vicious loop that keeps playing over and over again. But to me, this genre has done its damage, and it's time to put it behind us.
Absolutely. And you do that so well with your new book, The New Parisienne, and it can be found in bookstores the world over, Amazon. Thank you
I have it here,
so much.
just
And you have,
so
yes,
see.
there's beautiful, beautiful cover. And it's also a beautiful book. The photos inside are gorgeous, and you will find yourself making plans to get back to Paris. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
For our audience members, we have other events coming up. Coming up in August, there's going to be a wine tasting and celebrating the liberation of Paris, which should be interesting. So anybody who joins, I am going to if you join us, in the first 5 people who join, I'm going to personally send you a bonjour mask. I have been wearing mine all around Dijon and Paris, and everybody loves it. And so please join. And for those who already are members, thank you so much for your support. And I hope to see you in France or New York soon. So, and Thank you so much, Lindsey. And I
Thank
look forward
you.
to your next book. So,
To be continued.
yes.